dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Nurit David here. 2 years ago, we had hoped to welcome her as a guest of our institute for this annual lecture series, but the corona pandemic destroyed our plans, as neither Professor Bert David nor we wanted to replace this opportunity for direct academic exchange. Last night, Professor Bert David and I met for the first time in person when I picked her up at the airport here in Frankfurt and took her to Bad Homburg, where she is a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies for a month as part of our cooperation with the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, whose representative is here today also. Although we have only corresponded by phone and via email so far, last night I somehow had the impression of receiving an old acquaintance because I knew her through her publications and through so many courses I have personally attended in which her anthropological findings were discussed. I had the feeling that her thoughts had occupied me for a long time. This is mainly due to my teacher, Professor Georg Pfeffer, who unfortunately passed away almost exactly 2 years ago, and who told me about Professor Bert David's research in many seminars and lectures with fascination, and I see some students who can verify that. His fascinations had, in my opinion, several sources. First, he admired her research among the Nayaka, an extremely small community of very close relatives who live in the Nilgiri mountains of southern India and are usually classified in the literature as hunter-gatherers. Professor Bert David first visited these people in 1978, and many more research visits followed over the years, the results of which ultimately culminated in a PhD thesis in social anthropology at Cambridge University. My teacher and I were so fascinated by her research because it introduced us to an alternative social system or order that was very different from those we had encountered in India. On the one hand, we had dealt ourselves with Hindu caste society, whose ideas shape the lives of about 1 billion people nowadays in India. On the other hand, we had intensively studied the so-called tribal communities or tribal societies, which officially include at least 100 million people in India and many more if anthropological definitions are used. In sheer size alone, these societies differ significantly from the Nayaka, with whom Professor Bert David lived together and who stand for a form of coexistence about which anthropologists working in India know much less about than about the hierarchical orders of the caste or the segmentary orders of the tribes. In Odisha, in India, for example, where Professor Pfeffer and I conducted research in the highlands among different tribes, hunter-gatherers can only rarely be encountered. There is, however, a group called Bihor who are classified as hunter-gatherers by anthropologists and are referred to as Mankadia, the monkey hunters, by local people. They roam in small groups called bands in anthropology, and my only encounter with them many years ago left a lasting impression, partly because of the leaf huts, which they occupy for a few days and then move on, and partly because of their shyness and their seclusion. The differences between these people and the peasants known to us, who are organized in castes and in tribes with their homesteads and villages, their interest in wealth and accumulation, long-term investment, large festivals, complex orders of rank and status, were so striking that Professor Pfeffer and I wanted to know more about these hunter-gatherers, who often have their own niche existence unnoticed by the majority, and who often manage to elude the state with its bureaucracy. The research of Professor Bert David in particular provided us with insights, as did that of our Heidelberg colleague Ulrich Demmer, who also conducted research in the same area for many years among people known as Genu Kurumba, and the distinction between them and the Nayaka is not clear, as I was told. Second, what particularly impressed my teacher and me about Professor Bert David's work were her insights in Nayaka cosmology and kinship, which she published in some of the most prestigious journals in our field, such as Current Anthropology, Man, Social Anthropology, American Ethnologist, and so on. Normally, economic political issues dominate in research on groups formerly known as bands and later primarily classified as hunter-gatherers. The category itself, hunter-gatherers, links a way of life with a certain type of economy. That is, almost in a Marxist way, makes the economic relations the basis of the social order. In anthropological literature, this focus led to the fact that, especially in the writings on the African Sun and Hadza, hunting and gathering became a central object of research and was used to explain their whole way of life. Early on, Professor Bert David opposed such theories, for example, about the original affluent society or widespread economic reductionism. In her papers, she argues on the one hand that the Nayaka are from an economic point much more than simply hunters and gatherers, as they engage in all sorts of economic activities, for example, as traders of minor forest produce, as additionally as daily laborers, or occasionally as planters themselves in recent years. On the other hand, she shows that the specific way of life of the Nayaka is an expression of their cosmology, which, as with so many inhabitants of tropical forests, is characterized by a root metaphor that the forces of the forest are considered parents who unconditionally care for the well-being of their children. This effort to relate, so to say, cultural ideas to observable actions, it is to capture the Nayaka's view of their world in order to better understand their way of life, sounds like Malinowski, met with the greatest acceptance from our Berlin team, as we too strove to understand the specific characteristics of India's tribal society based on cosmology and kinship, rather than pure economics divorced from the logics of culture. Of particular interest to us were Professor Bert David's writings on sharing among the Nayaka and her insights that this sharing is not an expression of reciprocal expectations and long-term strategic planning. This intrigued us because in the tribal societies we studied, we found a cosmology informed by the idea of gift and sacrifice, of do-des, of giving, taking, reciprocating, which is the basis of the major ritual cycles we studied. On the other hand, we also recognize contexts of sharing in these tribal societies, and while my teacher always argued that this was quite different from the Nayaka, I always thought I detected certain similarities. Something I would like to discuss with the other sharing expert here, with Thomas Whitlock. Welcome also. What the work of Professor Bert David and others does indeed suggest is that sharing is not just some isolated aspect of social interaction, but is governed by encompassing ideas and values that are intimately connected to the society of the hunter and gatherers. These include the characteristic of what James Woodburn called immediate return systems among the Hadza, Peter Gardner's insights into the particular form of individualism among the Palyan, Ulrich Demmer's observation on conflict aversion and flight tendencies among the Genu Kurumba, and Nurit Burt-David's thesis on the animism of the Nayaka. I have always been fascinated by this latter aspect because the Dongriakon tribal society I have worked on is usually described as a totemic society, but I found among them some ideas Professor Burt-David describes for the animism of the Nayaka. She was among the first to address issues of animism and ontology with a focus on hunter-gatherers, and then related them to the debates from South America. To this day, at least to my knowledge, there are still few attempts to systematically apply the theses of Philippe Descola or Eduardo Vivero de Castro to the many religions of India. I was particularly impressed in this respect by Professor Burt-David's article, Animism Revisited, which appeared in Current Anthropology in 1999. In this, I think she goes beyond her earlier interpretation of Nayaka cosmology and approaches Tim Ingold's dwelling perspective. She demonstrates the extent to which Nayaka animism is not only an ontology, but also, and even more importantly, an epistemology. The Devaru or deities, who Professor Burt-David prefers to call superpersons to better capture the Nayaka perspective, are not just described as a priori persons. Rather, she argues, these Devaru become persons only by interaction and establishing personal relationships, sharing with them, and thus making them relatives. Or in Professor Burt-David's words, I quote, a hill Devaru, such a superperson, objectifies Nayaka relations with the hill. It makes known the relationships between Nayaka and that hill, unquote. Thus, it is everyday actions that create relationships or concrete kinship, not only between people, but also between people and their animate environment, which is experienced as father, mother, and so on. This insight that kin are not simply given, but must be made, has been used by Professor Burt-David, especially in recent years, to expand our understanding of these so-called hunter-gatherer societies. In her writing, she laments the scale blindness, as she calls it, of anthropology and the marginalization of the study of kinship in research on hunter-gatherers specifically. In many accounts of hunter-gatherers, she argues, the fact is suppressed that the people described are usually very closely related, not only in the genealogical sense, but especially by living together and by cooperating on a day-to-day basis. This is what Professor Burt-David calls immediate sociality. Instead, ethnographic descriptions often turn kin into groups of hunter-gatherers who are referred to as inhabitants, persons, individuals, without reference to the underlying conceptions. Thus, an image emerges of persons as discrete and pre-given entities that coalesce into a society consisting of singular beings. She further argues that not only the local kinship relations are suppressed, but also the extension of these kinship relations to non-human beings of the environment. This obscures the fact that in many hunter-gatherer communities, both human and non-human beings are connected by parental, procreative, affinal, or namesake relationships, such as among the Nayaka. These insights were very inspiring to me and my project members who are currently conducting extensive research on human crop relations in Odisha. Among various tribes, social relations involve environmental beings, such as when the rice crop is considered a bride or a woman is married to a tree. The big difference is certainly the size of the societies considered, what Professor Burt-David calls scale. Since 2017, she has repeatedly pointed out that hunter-gatherer societies are tiny or minuscule, you say, I think, compared to other forms of sociality, such as tribal orders or the caste society in India. Encyclopedias often describe these different societies without referring to the huge scale disparities. This disregard for scales even becomes even more questionable when these groups are then compared with one another, omitting the fact that the units of hunter-gatherers reported are barely larger than this room here or a school class, for example. Ultimately, Professor Burt David argues both the kinship practices of hunter-gatherers and their actual group size are crucial points in understanding their specific way of life. Indeed, she says, it is precisely, as I understand it, the performative way of generating kinship through sharing of food, space, and company that keeps the group size small. As she describes in her book, Us Relatives, published in 2017, she herself was able to become a relative of the Nayaka because of her performative generation of closeness, while other Nayaka who moved away lost their status as relatives. Those who live and share together are a community of heterogeneous beings, humans and non-humans, rather than more or less homogeneous beings with shared values and norms, as is commonly assumed of hunter-gatherers or tribes. From these considerations, she comes to far-reaching conclusions. For example, for our view of societies in early history, which I really find fascinating, or of the differences and similarities between hunter-gatherers, the smallest, and nations. Where am I? Which realize the ideal of plurality and diversity in a very different way, and above all on very different scales. She thus penetrates to the questions which she also addresses in this lecture series, and which seem to me to be quite fundamental for a comparative holistic cultural anthropology. What are the different visions of connectivities? We discussed that. She uses connectivity in the singular. What are the different visions of connectivities in the past and the present? How do they differ, and to what extent are they, after all, only variants of each other? I'm therefore very much looking forward to the next 4 lectures by Professor Burt David, whom I would like to welcome once again and hand over the floor to her. Thank you very much. So, now it's your turn. I switch this on. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for this generous invitation and for a very heart-opening welcome. Yesterday and today, I feel at home already. And I'm very honored to give these lectures in memory of A.E. Jensen. From what I could read about him in English, I wish I could have met and talked with him as an anthropologist and as a person. I'm impressed by his broad comparative interest so early in the 20th century, especially for him in the shift from hunter-gatherers to agricultural society, by his reading of diversity as means of learned speculations about evolution, and by his critical approach to the social evolutionism of his time, and his appreciation of the insight of the then called primitive people and primitive mentality so early on. I am touched by his loyalty to his Jewish wife during the Nazi period, both as a brave stand and as an act prioritizing relational connections over national, racial, group-based classifications. All of these themes that are embodied in his personal and his professional life are somehow expressed in my previous work and in the work that your invitation inspired me to take further. So I again thank for the invitation and the stimulation and the pressure of thoughts after I accepted your invitation to think about and develop my work. And I take this opportunity to share with you and think with you about work in process, which involves linking my long-term study of hunter-gatherer cultures with my recent research on the digitally based sharing economy, especially hosting strangers and staying with them at home through digitally based platforms like Airbnb. What I will do in the first lecture is I will try to very briefly just introduce to you how I arrived to this subject, and then for the rest of the main part of the lecture, I will develop the theoretical purpose and the framework of what I want to do, which involves balancing a very tight rope between different social scapes and complexities. I will qualify what I mean by hunter-gatherers, which for me is a brief for hunter-gatherer context, and I'll explain what I mean by it, and also by comparison, which for me, I elaborate on it later, which for me is not about finding similarities, but about mutually sensitizing attention to what we compare. My task in these terms is comparative, and what I will try to convince you, and myself, I must say, that hunter-gatherers show us connective structures of sociality and communality, which can help us think about present-day digitally based connective structures, and as important, vice versa. I will want to explore, in other words, human connective structures or connectivities, thank you, Roland. For example, I hope to explore with you if hunter-gatherers show us relational modes of subsisting in relational modes that subsist in intimate connections and transcending categorical separations, and whether intimate interactions become scalable across space through digital connections, and their scalability becomes the business of global capitalist powerful economic organizations. I will touch on social networks, how they are portrayed among hunter-gatherers, and whether and how they reflect and engage and intersect with social networks today, social network sites. I will look at how come we trust strangers, and how strangers, if the concept and how it exists among hunter-gatherers. But first, as I said today, I just want to first, just in a moment, to introduce myself in less formal ways than Roland did very beautifully. So I started to just explain I ask myself sometimes, how come I'm doing both, how come I joined these two things together? I studied economics and mathematics for my first degree. I even started to work in the Bank of Israel, but was very unhappy with this career, and I started traveling. I worked as assistant economist, occasional jeep driver in Sinai Peninsula. I worked as assistant economist and occasional cook assistant in safaris in the Kalahari a long time ago. And I traveled around hitchhiking Europe. We did these things in the 70s. My family, who worried about me wasting my time, set out for me a meeting with a friend of a friend in London, who turned out to be Professor Ernest Gellner, a very famous professor of anthropology. I didn't even know the word anthropology then. I asked him, what is anthropology? And what he replied in a sentence or two convinced me to continuing social anthropology. And since I approached my PhD study as a one-off opportunity for intellectual adventures before settling down to a noble job as an economist, I pursued my dream to study hunter-gatherers, and with my advisor, Alan McFarlane, and James Woodburn was in Cambridge all the time alongside me, we stick pins on the wall map in all parts of the world until we finally settled on studying forest people in the Nilgiri of South India. I plan to show you a few minutes from a film I shot in 1989 for a feel of the setup, but because of time I will do it in the next lecture. This adventure still continues on and on. For me, Roland really wonderfully and generally described some of the themes that I pursued. And I will turn to what I want to engage with that later. A decade ago, I started ethnographic work in Israel with students on an Israeli phenomenon, designing and building family homes with self-contracted architects and builders to achieve, within budgetary limits, the dream homes. We examined how the process reveals and cements cultural scenarios of personhood, family, sociality, communality, family, and others. And this interest in homes led me later to my interest in hosting strangers at home through Airbnb and such like platforms, and especially in staying in hosts who share their home space with their stranger guests. This involved reading a lot of literature on digitalized social life, even digital society and digital age, some would go saying, and eventually to the hunch that there is much to learn from and need for examining hunter-gatherers and digitally based connective as another alternative to collective structures. So I turned now to develop this theoretical framework for this quest. I forgot all the... This is just, I'll skip to this first two. This is my combining the two links. This is a film we won't see today, and this is the next. Since the 17th century, with earlier sporadic incidents we can skip here, Europeans have been turning to exotic populations for thinking about themselves and their place in history. They turn to imaginations, to informed accounts, and later to first-hand studies of such people. The collective label for these people have been changing during the centuries: savages, primitives, hunter-gatherers, gather-hunters, foragers, post-foragers, indigenous people, etc. Europeans, and after them scholars and lay people throughout the world, have continued to turn to them as reference point for thinking about human nature, evolution, history, institution, and more and more and more. The issues keep changing, reflecting global changing worries, concerns, ideals, and fantasies. To turn to this population, who, to simplify the matter, I tag hunter-gatherers, and I will qualify below what I mean by it, has persisted today despite profound changes, including major ontological and epistemological shifts. One can hardly imagine a more game-changer transformation than from taking the world to be a few thousand-year-old and divinely ordered to perceiving it after Darwin as a complex system evolving by chance and natural selection for millions of years, or shifting from the idea that people show us the natural wild man as people who lived at the dawn of human history, to perceiving them as co-fellow humans with sophisticated cultures who can advise us on how to mend our present ways and solve our future problems. Turning to them, be it for scientific, symbolic, spiritual, or other reasons, has persisted today globally, has persisted through globally sweeping processes: colonization, industrialization, enlightenment, scientific evolution, the rise of nation societies and the capitalist economy, liberalism and humanism, and this is just a short list. The tradition persists throughout technological changes, affecting everyday experience, the invention of trains and cars, of electricity and telephones, of home design for nuclear families separate from shops and workshops, and increasingly equipped with electric media and digital gadgets. One could expect this tradition to exhaust itself because the life of these people, who we call hunter-gatherers, have radically changed since, certainly in the 20th century, but it doesn't. Lawrence Marshall was an American engineer whose job took him away from his family and home for a long spell of time, and when he retired in 1950, set his heart on adventure with his family, however with value to science. He and his wife Lorna, an English teacher, decided to travel with their two adolescent children to the Kalahari Desert and document the life race of the vanishing Bushman people. What interests me here in this story is that they wanted to take an anthropology graduate with them. And living in Boston, they turned to the anthropology department at Harvard with an attractive offer, subsidizing a whole year journey for a graduate student. And no single student was then prepared to take a year off and join them. The Bushmen were at that time regarded as marginal, disappearing people that aspiring would-be anthropologists would not waste their time on. And then, 10 years later, in the early 1960s, a smart MA student of primates, Richard Lee, proposed that these Bushmen people can offer invaluable insights on our human ancestors in the African savanna, better than any we can hope to gain from studying primates. His work on them, and then a celebrated conference that he co-organized with Irvin Devon and the Hunter, initiated the comparative study of groups of people around the globe who, like the Kung, hunted-gathered for their subsistence. That is modern hunter-gatherer study. It's also changed personally. The Marshall Ice family, too, they had 3 good careers from this adventure. And later I should mention that whether the Kung are genuine or not, or were invented as hunter-gatherers, was fiercely debated in the 1980s. Are they hunter-gatherers or just romanticized, marginal, dispossessed poor people? Surely the flesh and blood people who you meet and talk with are real, and only the categories through which they are framed and approached are changeable and different. These people are not fictionalized by these frameworks, which only direct attention to some features and not others of their past and present lifeways. Their lifeways, anyway, continue to unfold, change, and diversify. Concerned with their changing and diversifying lifeways, Thomas Whitlock suggested to accurate our terminology by speaking about hunter-gatherers situations instead of hunter-gatherers. From my long-term perspective on what I call the hunter-gatherer term, I prefer to use hunter-gatherer context. Context can change from contemporaneous political struggle and rights through the creativity and diversity of human culture they show us, to the clues abstracted from their lives for interpreting evolutionary and prehistoric evidence. This context can extend into and shed light on one another, but none of them, nor all of them together, tell us who these people are, which continue evolving as these people continue their lives of becoming. If you want, I opt for a relational rather than an essentialist mode of approaching and knowing these people, something I learned from them. So for brief, I use hunter-gatherers, because hunter-gatherer context is very clumsy, but always in the latter sense. I want to qualify also my use of comparison. In the Merriam-Webster dictionary, you find the representation of one thing or person as similar to or like another, an examination of 2 or more items to establish similarities and dissimilarities, identities of features, similarity, all this emphasis and capital letters appear in the origin. It's listed in the computer search. This dictionary definition captures the popular meaning of comparison, an act of establishing similarities and dissimilarities between 2 or more distinct entities. This sense is used in anthropology, for example, when comparing culture of what is similar in all of them and can be regarded as a human universal. But comparison is also used in another sense, as an interpretative act that provides a point of view, a perspective. Comparison in this sense is inherent to all observations of other cultures that initially at least are always in the observer's own cultural terms, until in time, a long time, the observer gains a sense of the local alternatives. Usually, this kind of comparison is implicit, but sometimes it is strategically used explicitly. Comparison in this sense involves mutually differentiating the entities you compare through mutual playing of perspective on one another, what you see in X from the perspective of Y, and what you see in Y from the perspective of X, continuously. This kind of comparison is championed as a valuable tool in grounded theory of qualitative research, as well as in anthropology. There's a nice book, By Comparison, edited by Gingrich and Fox. Comparison in this sense undergirds my work generally, and here implicitly or implicitly. So I turn to the next section, and it is hunter-gatherers on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The issues subsumed in the hunter-gatherer's turn have proliferated from the 17th century to the present. Today I dwell on a few selected issues, but I first just want again to give you a glimpse of their diversity so we don't forget. This issue range from human innate nature, are we innately aggressive, through gender roles, are women naturally caregivers, the origin of modern institutions like property, the nuclear family, human prehistory and evolution, perception of the environment, sustainable environmental practice, egalitarian structures, social networks, alternative ontologies and epistemologies, and on and on and on. And today what I want to do is to dwell in more detail on the foundational work of Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which in common regard started this hunter-gatherer turn with contrary views of the state of man in nature. So the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes tried in his magnum opus Leviathan to figure the emergent society of his time through a story of the origin and development of human society. What I'll try through these stories is to constantly combine the personal and the broad picture as part of my message and as part of what I'm trying to do throughout. So he wrote his Leviathan to figure the emergent society of his time through a story of the origin and the development of human society. He published Leviathan in 1651 at the end of the English Civil War between royalists and parliamentarians about principally the manners of England's governors. He wrote it in Paris, to which he flew as he had earlier tutored members of the royal family, and there he associated with exiled royalists who arrived there too. He described in the book, that is all too known, cited and recited, and I just briefly mention it, that the natural condition of mankind is one of war, of all against all. Men lived in a state of nature, in continual fear and danger of violent death. The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and so on. And this state, he wrote, could only be improved through social contact and the rule of an absolute sovereign. Now, the Paris in which Hobbes wrote this book was a fast-growing city, with many poor people in the streets, elderly, sick, and unable to work, and thieves too. Streets were crowded with people, horses, cattle, carts, and carriages. The town was dark at night. Outside lanterns were installed on street corners 5 years after the Leviathan was published. But the hunter-gatherer mirror on the wall was... Sorry, my computer jumped here. Missing some lines. Sorry about that. But the hunter-gatherers on the wall was turned to for saying that the contemporary political society was the fairest in the world. More than 100 years later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau published his The Origin of Inequality in 1775. In the hunter-gatherer turn, these more than 100 years are played down as Rousseau's view is simplified in binary opposition to Hobbes' view, namely, says Rousseau, in the state of nature, man is innately moral and compassionate and enjoys the affluence of the earth. Inequality, along with envy and conflict, developed with growing contact and property claims. The 100 years between expressing these two views were years of tremendous changes in Europe and the expanding world. The very decade of the book's publication saw the American Revolution, the growing political pressure in France leading to the French Revolution a decade later, the expansion of the European horizons with James Cook's second journey, discovering and beginning to settle in Australia, the start of the Industrial Revolution, a global credit crisis as banks throughout France, England, Scotland, and the colonies of the British North America nearly collapsed, and the publications on the same year as The Origin of Equality of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nature. Equality and inequality were issues in the air, so to speak, during these times, and they found their way into Rousseau's writing and the interest in it. Rousseau's own life is too fascinating to ignore. I want it, but I can't ignore it. A philosopher, composer, and music scholar, his life could furnish a Netflix series with more than half a dozen seasons. He moved up and down the social ladder, collapsing class distinctions. He was born in Geneva, the son of a watchmaker married to an aristocrat woman. His mother died when he was young. His father later remarried and hardly saw his son. The son left home at the age of 16, stayed with a noble woman twice his age and later was her lover. Then he married an illiterate seamstress who by his account bore him 5 children, all of them they deposited in a hospital after their birth. Penniless at the age of 30, he won an Academy Prize for his discourse on the science and arts, and 4 years later, he published The Origin of Inequality. But then he published Emile and The Social Contract, for which he was prosecuted on grounds of religious heterodoxy, and he sought refuge in England. Throughout his life, he traveled and lived in Switzerland, France, Italy, and England. We have both figures who are travel a lot, they have their own place in life is quite raising questions. 370 years after Leviathan was published, and nearly 250 years after The Origins of Inequality the Hobbesian and Rousseauian socio-political counter-projection of men in the state of nature are still invoked as the cornerstones of the hunter-gatherer turn. Just last year, in 2021, David Graeber, the late David Graeber, and David Wengrow engaged with his 17th and 18th works in their much-talked-about book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Like Hobbes and Rousseau, the political approaches and positions of these authors, especially Graeber, bear on their work. David Wengrow brought to this joint work his archaeological expertise. The late David Graeber, known largely for his big history books on value, debt, rebellion, and bureaucracy, brought to this joint project also his personal anarchist upbringing, political positions, and leadership. He led with others the 2011 political movement known by the phrase credited to him, "We are the 99%. The Dawn of Everything, among other things, rewrite history from an anti-hierarchical anarchist position as a charter for today's society's egalitarian potentialities. To put it short, this also critiques the currently dominant modern story of the origin of society, a story of small egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups, demographically growing, starting to grow food, continuing to expand and develop more and more production technologies, and in the process become inevitably complex, hierarchical societies. This received story, they argue, is simply not true. This is their words, and has their words dire political implications. Through a tour de force, through anthropological, archaeological, and historical literature and research, old and new, they rewrite the history. Early hunter-gatherers had different political forms, egalitarian and hierarchical. They were socially creative and diverse, showing us bold social experiments. Over thousands of years, they shifted playfully between hunting and gathering and agriculture, and between egalitarian and hierarchical social structure. Much of what they write is wonderful, but I have to leave it aside and focus on what concerned me in their book for my present project. Now, it is interesting that Graeber and Wengrow want to revise the current modern story of the origin of society, however, keep the genre, the templates, the purpose, the style. They are not against a story as such of the development of modern society from its hunter-gatherer origin. They only want, as they outright put it, the true story, one which is richer, one which is more nuanced, one which is based on new evidence, and show other political implications. In short, to put it simply, they simply want a better story. Among their original and impressive moves towards this aim, they examine the origin of the modern story about the origin of society, and especially the origin of the question about the origin of social inequality. For philosophers of the Enlightenment, like Hobbes and Rousseau, they argue, reacted to the critique of indigenous commentators and critical observers of European lives that reached Europe. The native critique Graeber and Wengrow propose, inspired European thinkers to look on their society and comparatively on the natives and develop their modern story of the origin of human society. So two figures, more colorful than Hobbes and Rousseau, who surely were lively enough, enter the canonical start of the hunter-gatherer turn in Graeber and Wengrow's version. The first is an impoverished French aristocrat named Louis Armand de Lhomme d'Arc, Baron de la Hontan, who came to be known, luckily for me at least, as La Hontan. He joined the French army when he was 17 years old, was posted in Canada, took part in several campaigns and exploratory expeditions, rose to the rank of deputy of the government general, and by the time he reached his late 20s, he fell out of favor, was convicted, and fled to Europe. He wandered around Europe, lived penniless in Amsterdam, and then published a series of books about his adventures in Canada. The third one, entitled Curious Dialogue with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled, this is the title of the name, related his dialogues with a Native American man named Candiarnock, a member of the Huron-Wendat people, widely heard as an astute statesman, and in Graeber and Wengrow's words, he was unusually brilliant. This book changed La Hontan's luck. It circulated in European salon and now is digitally spreading widely, with a new turn in the hunter-gatherer turn. A native statement, together with European philosophers, asked hunter-gatherers on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? I move to the next section, which I call Ontologically Modern Order and Questions. And this is to say that beside its persistent socio-political motivation and projections, something else strikes me in the hunter-gatherer turn today. Ontologically assuming separate individuals as a social ontological framework within which questions about their collective actions are raised and pursued. To illustrate it, I first use a wonderful book published in 2009, remember 2009, by Sarah Blaifer Hardy. It's called Mother and Others, The Evolutionary Origin of Human, of Mutual Understanding. She was trained in anthropology, and then she studied primate behavior. She studied langours in India, and she set out to explore the origins of human hypersociality, mothers and others, cooperative, empathic, caring and sharing behavior. It is again a very rich book in which, among other things, she turned to hunter-gatherers, which is what I use for my purposes, and I even just do with her introduction, because she starts the book with a chapter called Apes on a Plane, and she described in a very rich and detailed way a common experience for billions of passengers today traveling on airplanes. I'll read it quickly. Patiently, we line up to be checked and patted down by someone we've never seen before. We file on board an aluminum cylinder and cram our bodies into narrow seats, elbow to elbow, accommodating each other for as long as the flight takes. With nods and resigned smiles, passengers make eye contact and then yield to latecomers pushing through. When a young man wearing a backpack hits me with it as he reaches up to cram his paraphernalia into an overhead compartment, instead of grimacing or baring my teeth, I smile weakly, distinguishing my irritation, and so on and so forth. Apes in such circumstances, Hardy states, will be aggressive, with torn bits of bodies scattered around to show for it. For humans, she dryly notes, no dismemberments have been reported yet. And she asks, therefore, how come? How can we explain the exceptional hypersocial behavior of humans' behavior towards each other? By the way, I cut it because of time shortage. Jared Diamond, in one of his books, also used this airport scene. He described an airport in Papua New Guinea in 2006, in very similar way. I'll stick with Hardy here for... Her introduction shows, as an X-ray of thoughts, individuals as the ontological skeleton on which her inquiry hangs, with its leading question: how had separate individuals come to cooperate with one another? If Hobbes argues that separate individuals can cooperate only through social contract, Hardy now looks for evolutionary processes and mechanisms. However, in pursuit of the same question that arises within the socio-ontological axioms of individuals pre-given as separate beings. Now, leading 20th century sociologists visualize the train as Hardy and Diamond do the airport in terms that highlight the modern order. In Practice of Everyday Life, Michel de Certeau described it beautifully in over 4 pages, really great. And I just give bits of sentences here. The traveler is pigeonholed, numbered, and regulated in the grid of the railway car, a perfect actualization of the rational utopia. Control and food move from pigeonhole to pigeonhole. Tickets, please, sandwich, beer, coffee, everything has its place in the grid work. A bubble of pantopic and classifying power, traverse space and make itself independent of local rules. I'll skip. I wanted to show you a few minutes from the film The Terminal of 2004. There is a wonderful description of airport, just as Hardy described it. These crowds of individual people crossing through, coming to the counters, checked, and so on. What we see in this picturesque description of social experience in train and in the airplane is frame of analysis that is much less noticed, but it exists in modern hunter-gatherer studies, which in a similar way is often pinned on assuming groups constitutive of individuals. And for an illustrative example, I use James Woodbourne, 1982 article, Egalitarian Society, which speaks with the same theme that I spoke until now, and also it has a huge impact and still generate debates on the subject of hunter-gatherer egalitarian structure. Now, James Woodbourne described in his early ethnographic work of the Hadda the close kinship ties connecting their members, and he characterized Hadza and other hunter-gatherer societies by what he called a universal kinship system, where everyone within the political community regards everyone else as kin and addresses them by kinship terms. But in Egalitarian Society, which was written 2 years later, he frames these people as individuals living in a society, which led him to ask, how does the individual hunter, and why does the individual hunter share the game he hunted? And his answer is the group's egalitarian ideology, which he distinguished as a kind of assertive equality, quote, the political assertive equality of the French variety, from the Western competitive equality, basis of equal chance to get property and power. Now, had the connective structure of the Hadza community guided his analysis, rather than the individual in society ontological framework, it might have preempted the questions Wood would try to answer, his forays into Western ideological landscapes, and later counter-arguments in the debates about his position, reverse dominant hierarchy, or as Graeber and which Boehm suggested, or as Graeber and Wengler suggest, seasonal shift between egalitarian and hierarchical structure. Now, elsewhere I use this image. This is a film we won't see. This is Woodbourne, which I haven't shown you. And this is elsewhere I use this image to illustrate my point. When the vessels are separate and come in different shapes and sizes, how do you equally share liquid between them? What does equal means in this case? Equal in terms of volume, level, volume proportionally to the vessel size. Furthermore, how is this equal distribution, in whatever sense you define it, achieved through intentional decision-making or external political force? Now imagine instead vessels connected. The liquid in this case flows between the vessels until it's leveled out. This happens in and because the vessels are connected. The connective structures acts. Thus, ontologically framing hunter-gatherers as connected people can preempt arguing for the assertive equality or other arguments. Assuming a connective framework, instead of humans per given as separate individuals living and acting in collective structures, would lead to asking different questions. And perhaps the insights that can be gained from such an approach could help out these kind of evolutionary questions. I move to one before the last, I think. The hunter-gatherer turn after nature society, or why has nature trumped society? So I'm looking at a more recent stage in the hunter-gatherer turn. Turning to hunter-gatherers dramatically changed from approaching them 300-400 years ago as men in the state of nature, to asking 200 years ago, later, how their societies and cultures are adapted to subsisting on nature, and by the late 20th century to their ways of approaching nature, including their alternative to the modern dualistic framework within which they were until then studied, the binary nature-society. This chapter, for the most, consisted today of turning to hunter-gatherers for their perception of the environment, propelled by growing Western environmental concerns since the late 20th century, and at a junction with and substantially contributing to the ontological term. I want, in passing, just to mention that ontology and epistemology are Western philosophical terms, categories, and anthropologists use them as a way to avoid saying that the world around us is as Western know it, through modern science and its categories, whereas that which the other people say it is but their unfounded beliefs and worldviews. Work in these veins, intersecting with hunter-gatherer studies, included, as Roland mentioned, Philippe Escola, Eduardo Rivera Castro, Tim Ingold, also my work. In these kinds of work, the relational nature of beings and their co-emergence, their mutual coming into being, is richly described. Since Roland described it so well, I skip describing what I wrote about it. You did a wonderful job. And I move on. Shaking the nature-society modern divides invites exploring ontological modes of society as well as of nature. But nature trumps society in both the hunter-gatherer and the ontological terms today. Tim Ingold clearly argued in 1999 that the forms of hunter-gatherers life cannot be understood as instances of any essential type of society. The distinctiveness of hunter-gatherer sociality, he wrote, lies in its subversion of the very foundations upon which the concept of society, taken in any of its modern senses, has been built. Hunter-gatherers show us how it is possible to live socially, that is, to conduct human life within an unfolding matrix of relationship with other, human and non-human, without having to live in societies at all. But little had been done in this direction. Ingold himself, alongside other students, turned to focus on indigenous alternatives to modern Western concept of nature. I tried in my book and in recent articles to figure out the hunter-gatherers' ontological alternative to the modern construct of society, and this project has turned to be immensely complicated because anthropological and ethnographic analyses and even seemingly neutral ethnographic descriptions are grounded in modern ideas of society. Even the necessary ethnonymic and geographical designation of the ethnographers studied people, I argued, complicates a serious study of their alternative social ontologies, and almost from the start distorted. Ethnographic and anthropological analyses are too ingrained in a modern categorist, collectivist sense of society as a bounded entity constitutive of individuals. What I think, what I hope, is that the digital era, with its digitally based new connective structures, offer a new comparative launching pad for studying hunter-gatherer social forms, And those, in turn, can provide a comparative standpoint for addressing our time's emergent concern and issues. But remember that I do not use comparison as a search for similarities, but a tool for mutual sensitization to detail. So I move to my last section, a new chapter in human history, a new chapter in the hunter-gatherer term. We live, well, this has to be said, but it's obvious, we live in a rapidly digitalizing society. We cope with, we benefit from, we suffer from digitally based modes of being with, knowing, and communicating with others. Emailing, WhatsApping, Facebooking, Airbnbing, Ubering, and many other actions facilitated by digital platforms and applications have been integrated into the daily practices of billions of people around the globe. These actions afford new and modified old ways of interpersonal and communal interactions that young generations are born into, and older ones adopt in ways and speeds that they couldn't imagine possible when they had grown up. The digital is growing scholarly and popular attentions, observing how it changed the world and how the world, in Daniel Miller's word, changed it. The digital draw attention as a new realm, if not altogether an emergent digital society and digital age, and at any rate, as a new chapter in human history. Now, as in any good book, the plot and characters continue from chapter to chapter. No new story, no new reality starts afresh as we move from chapter to chapter. But something happens. Something new is added, new layers, new dimensions, new possibilities to adopt or resist, new ways of pursuing the old that come with nuanced affordances and limits. At least in this sense, if not in others, we enter a new chapter in human history. Today, its basis is Web 2.0, which is also known as participative or participatory web and social web. The term was coined in 1999. The system took over the digitalized world in the early 2000s, precisely when the ontological chapter in the hunter-gatherer turn began. As yet, however, the hunter-gatherer turn still stops short at the threshold of the digital and doesn't cross it. Graeber and Wengrow's New History of Humanity, published in 2021, just last year, does not acknowledge the digital. The word itself turns up only 4 times in the book, 600 pages, and is not indexed at all. You would think that the digital chapter of human history is relevant, even crucial, to a new history of humanity from an anti-hierarchical anarchist position and as a charter for present-day egalitarian potentiality. But no, there's no mention of it. I take you back to Hardy's aviation social experience as setting for raising her question. She wrote it, she published it in 2009. I flew yesterday from Tel Aviv to Frankfurt. Almost every passenger in the airport was busy with their digital gadgets, cellular, iPad, laptop. Many of them digitally communicated with friends, family members, work associated, Facebook friends, WhatsApp groups. In the crowd, I saw parents playing with their children, spouses walking together, groups of friends talking aloud. This was all to be seen in the 2000 airport scene, I bet on it. Only we have not been sensitized to see it, keeping with the modern vision of the airport as a vision for modern life. This vision at best describes some macro scales of modern life, but not all scales, and not how they are integrated right down to intimate life together. Is it too early to consider the new digital chapter in human history? Not at the speed in which the world is digitalizing, with a view already to Web 3.0. Does the digitalizing world, which is changing around us, raise no concern on which to turn to hunter-gatherers, as we've done before for 300-400 years? It surely does. Connections, connectedness, connectivity, connecting and disconnecting have become key terms in today's digital age. emergent, digitally based, everyday modes of sociality and communality add on the past 3 centuries collective modes of grouping individuals as collectives of all sorts, be it an imagined society, a nation state, a corporation, a municipality, a club, and multitude of other examples. The digital era presents us with new connective structures, and the use of the word as alternative to collective structures. Some work explores the junction between hunter-gatherers and digital society, and again, for lack of space, once I learned that Roland is so generous with his introduction, I cut pieces and kept it for the next lecture. So there are some work from both the digital side and the hunter-gatherer side who try to reach one another, but it's not done yet in a thorough, solid ways. And I will survey these little attempts. It will take me only a paragraph in the next lecture. But here I have some of the articles. What I want to do in this series of lecture, I want to go down to go with this line. What moves my series of lectures then is my hunch, which I hope to develop here with you, that the Web 2.0 connective praxis can provide a productive model for approaching hunter-gatherers' social and communal form that I and many others failed to grasp until now with our collective terms and ontology, and in turn, through and with hunter-gatherers, look at our emergent and changing social and communal modes. Now, I must admit that I'm an inexperienced child in the digital world, as I was in the world of forest foragers, Nayaka of South India, when I started my research with him. So, and this outside participant observation standpoint, this outside participant observer standpoint, had its benefits as well as its backdraws. And this said, I just want to encourage you, your questions and comments throughout the series of lecture, except for today, since we don't have too much time, but I think we have some. I would most welcome your comments, and I'm sure they will be very useful. So thank you.